Namaskar. Hello and welcome to P Guru's channel. I'm your host Sri Iyer. Middle East or West Asia, whichever way you want to call it. Right now, this is in the news, perhaps for all the wrong reasons. Let us today join the former Minister of State for External Affairs, Sri M.J. Akbar, who has spent many years understanding, reading, going through this region, meeting all the heads, and to get his perspective on how he sees things unfolding and what lies in the future, near term as well as long term. So the format that we're going to follow today is Sri M.J. Akbar will give his opening remarks, and then Sridhar Chityalaji, who's the guest host, will be asking him a few questions. And after that, we will throw open the floor for questions from you, the viewer. Looking forward to a very energizing session. Sri M.J. Akbarji, namaskar and welcome to P Guru's channel.
Namaskar, namaskar. Thank you very much.
And please go ahead, sir. Please go ahead, sir. Floor is yours.
Yeah, Sriyarji and Sridharji. It is a coincidence, the 20th anniversary of 9/11, a day which will remain imperishable in our memory. 20 years later, in the city of New York, two young women, Emma Raducanu and Leila Fernandez, are playing the finals of the US Open tennis. The thought struck me that both these young women were born after 9/11. They are stars. They are stars who will deservedly earn millions, who will earn adulation, who will win fame. But there are hundreds of thousands of their sisters in Afghanistan who have suddenly, since the middle of August, been denied the right to play sports, to participate in what we would consider normal activity, who are going to be victims of gender oppression in a world which has suddenly, dramatically changed before their very eyes. Without warning, suddenly, their dreams collapsed. Their thoughts today are probably what I would describe as phantom thoughts of what might have been. This is the legacy of a nation, of an intervention that once had so much promise. And after 20 years, the one question which strikes me, and we must answer for the sake of our own selves, really, for the sake of civilization. 20 years later, have the terrorists won? And if the capitals of the world ignore this question, then they will be doing some serious damage. President Joe Biden of America has said in explanation or perhaps expiation of what he did, that Americans can no longer be the world's policemen. It brings me to another question. Was 9/11, did 9/11 happen outside America? Doesn't he, as President of America, have the duty to be America's policeman against terrorism and against terrorists? Has the American withdrawal from the most notorious hotspot, sanctuary of terrorism, actually signaled to this netherworld that the doors that had shut on 9/11, on 20 years ago, may have been reopened because perhaps not negligence, but certainly because of indifference. The second major development is that in order to justify the abetment to the rise of Taliban, which is now back in power in Kabul, much of the world, much of the West, is beginning and ready to deal with Afghanistan and deal with the new regime through Islamabad. Handing the responsibility of that region to Pakistan is akin, in my view, to handing over the fire brigade to the arsonist. It is a dangerous development. I presume that the world is more skeptical about Pakistan after its experience of the last 2 decades than it was in 1996. But I cannot be sure. Third, everyone is asking one question: has the Taliban changed? My answer to that is very simple. An ideological movement cannot change, because the moment it compromises, it will be actually destroyed from within. The Taliban has not changed ideologically, but something else has changed. Afghanistan has changed. Kabul has changed. Herat has changed. The people have changed. They have seen in the last 20 years, as I mentioned, a new generation has seen what it means to live in a world where there is at least a semblance of democracy, or far greater democracy than they had ever experienced before, a liberal lifestyle. I have been to Kabul many times during these years and have seen the schools, seen women becoming part of the school process, educational process of media, coming out to work, becoming members, equal members of Afghan society. Suddenly, all of that has regressed. We don't know what is going to happen, but I cannot at this moment be anything but a trifle pessimistic.
Sridharji, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, MJG, for the wonderful context. I think you have framed the issue as well as some of the questions that we can, take the discussion forward. In United States, one of the fundamental questions that is being asked before we get to the world is 20 years, $8 trillion, 900,000 plus lives lost. 9/11 is a memory that we regrettably every year think about and reflect, and what we could have done different. Ironic as it stands today that the regime that we plan to replace is the regime that is back in charge. The concept of transitional governance, where Taliban is just a part of it, not holistically managing this, was the exit strategy that originally was signed by President Trump and led to Mr. Biden completing it. But where we are today is completely different to that specific agenda. So what do you think has gone wrong in your view, sitting distant but yet proximus to Kabul, MJG?
Well, we in India are certainly closer to Kabul in many ways, including in terms of the direct consequences than people in the West. But nevertheless, the point is that we are all vulnerable. We are suddenly all vulnerable. I don't know about the 900,000 people you said who have been killed since 20, but I don't think that number is, that must be a total list of all the casualties in many wars, not just in Afghanistan. Let's come down to, brass tacks. One of the reasons, as I said, was that the President of America said that, we cannot have troops because they cannot be vulnerable. Have you ever thought and asked yourself how many troops did America actually have? 5,000, 4,000, 3,500 when President Biden took the oath of office and till now? It was really never about, sorry?
I said it was roughly 2,500 when he took
office. That's it, 2,500. America has many more troops elsewhere, but 2,500 troops. You know what they did? It was never about troops. It was only about American presence. It was about the power of America. It was about the fear of reprisals if you change the system that the world considered certainly a far better, for all its faults. I understand, for all its faults. The world and the civilized world considered far better than what had gone before. 2,500 troops, that's all. As I said, it was about American presence once, and the threat of reprisal. Once that threat was removed and America weakened, I think that that moment signaled a fundamental weakness of all the, in the armory of all those who had been fighting terrorism. And that is really where I think the inability, first, of the world to recognize that the process that America had launched with Mr. Khalilzad was fundamentally a compromise too far. And the inability also of the rest of the world to explain to the American system that the dangers were far greater than they could possibly have imagined or conceived or calculated. The inability of the rest of the world to persuade America about reality perhaps shows some lack of diplomatic ability. I'm surprised that many of the NATO members were surprised. Why were they surprised? Didn't they have people who were following the talks in Qatar? Some of these things simply escape my understanding. All I know is that the world lost the plot, but the plot hasn't lost the world. It will come back.
Very, very regrettable. Qatar, that has been playing the pivotal role as the negotiator or the facilitator of the negotiations. That's the only country where Taliban had a footprint in terms of representative office, and all the discussions were held in Qatar. So the question, therefore, is could they have played a better role? Because the condition of negotiation, condition of transition was a transition government which had a democratically elected, whatever you may want to call democratic, to be the component of the transitional government. Now, as you said today, there is no transitional representation. All you have is the alleged terrorists or the alleged warlords who were responsible for where we were 20 years ago.
Yes, there is really no point, blaming Qatar. Qatar was a facilitator. A facilitator is not the principal player in any negotiations, whether that negotiation be in business or diplomacy or in world affairs. That's one. So, this call was what NATO wanted to call it. This call was what America wanted to make of it. What surprises me is that this deal was done without understanding the nature of the problem. I mean, we were not talking about an ordinary deal in which America had to sort of take a call on whether it should be present in some part of the world or not. We are talking about a world war, the first great world war of the 21st century, which is a war on terrorism. We were not talking of anything less than that. And if the price of preserving the status quo was only 2,500 American soldiers plus a few NATO contingents in well-secured, well-financed bases in Bagram, I don't think in the last 18 months, 20 months, there was more than one American casualty. Even one casualty is regrettable. Of course, it is regrettable. But in a war, that is a price that one has to be ready to pay. Every nation understands this. So, as major a confrontation in this, and then to believe that you could actually trust an ideologically committed force which has a very perfectly well defined agenda, which it has made no secret of its agenda. That's also true. There was, I must, say this very honestly. The Taliban has never made any secret of its agenda, of its doctrines. When it says that it will be ruled by its own version of the Sharia, a version of the Sharia which the overwhelming majority of Muslims don't live under. When it said that it would, life and governance would continue out of it, how can you believe that it is going to be a patron of gender equality? And why should you believe that? Why is it that subject nobody talks about? Hides under it, out of embarrassment, out of guilt, perhaps. But history, current events are the basis of knowing about current events is media. The basis of knowing the larger truth is through history. And history will be very harsh in its judgments of what happened this year.
Would you consider this to be a complete naivete, given the questions that we are, discussing here? Because the Biden administration has laid emphasis on two important facets. One is the evacuation of the people who are stranded, to be reliant on Taliban to be providing safe passage. And second, the governance within the Afghanistan under the Taliban to be following respect for human rights and all the kinds of things that the Western world follows. They continue to insist this. They continue to maintain this in the media releases in United States, contrary to the points that you are raising and the ground reality.
Both of us were very much around and alive and aware 20 years ago when I certainly saw the events from a hotel room and after a sudden call. We have to ask you a very simple question. All have to ask ourselves, did America go to war 20 years ago merely in order to take back all the people who helped it for 20 years? Or did America go to war because it wanted peace, stability, and a civilized world? What took America there? What took NATO there? In the last 20 years, I'm very, very happy to say, and particularly in the last few years, India has taken a very proactive role in helping create the infrastructure. We had invested about more than, if I'm not wrong, at least $3 billion, if not more, in creating dams, in creating schools, in creating human need infrastructure. What did we do it for? We did it. We built a parliament. What did we do it for? Because we believed that the 21st century must run by certain values. Those values include democracy. Those values include freedom. Those values include the rights of free speech, of multi-faith unity, of pluralism. That is why we invested. That is why the world went where. That is why the world was ready to offer its blood. It didn't offer its blood and its commitment for 20 years in order to evacuate 20 years later. I don't think even the other NATO members would actually have agreed with this plan and this process if they had been fully aware of it.
Yes. I think as you look at NATO, EU, one can see probably two, France and probably United Kingdom, more specifically UK, raising its hand and fearing the consequences of what is to come out. And there have been discussions going on with the Mr. Biden's team, notably led by Mr. Antony Blinken, who is the Secretary of State. But do you believe that they have any influence either with United States or with anyone in Afghanistan in shaping the next phase of the journey?
It's a very, very interesting question. I would seriously doubt. I mean, at the moment, people are on a wait and watch mode, frankly. Uh, I mean, the recent tour, for example, of the German foreign minister began on a note of perhaps quiet optimism and ended on a note of realistic, well, I don't want to use the word despair, but on a more realistic note, say, of pessimism. Uh, People who thought that the discussions would have led to greater commitments by the Taliban are becoming increasingly disappointed. What is unfolding really is what might be called an unconditional withdrawal, an unconditional retreat. That is really the true danger. And it is Taliban actually which is saying that America is not keeping its promises. I don't know what promises America made, or the West made, or NATO made, but uh, were no promises extracted from the Taliban about what would be the nature of government? Would it be inclusive? Would it be accountable? Accountable to the people, I mean. What conditions were discussed? What did Mr. Khalilzad do on behalf of two administrations? Are we seeing simply cut and run on perhaps the most dangerous battlefield in contemporary world? There are too many questions and not enough answers.
I think President Trump has been fairly vocal in terms of the exit strategy, which for anybody who is, practical common sense will tell you that you move people first, you move equipment next, and then finally you take the troops out. This is just a common sense, forgetting the nature of evacuation that would happen when you have armed forces. But we have exactly the opposite that has occurred. First, the armed forces left, the equipment was left behind, and finally, the people were left to fend themselves, and then
Yeah,
many people stranded.
absolutely. $75 billion when somebody last counted of equipment. And then we will next ask where Taliban is getting its arms from. And I understand that a neighboring country, well, I mean, what's the secret about it? Pakistan has now intervened in picking up all the sophisticated equipment which the Taliban doesn't know how to handle. Pakistan has been getting American arms for a long while, so it's familiar with them. But they probably have left, things which also have left a vast number of things which the Taliban can use and is using. I mean, suddenly you see them, the Badri unit of the Taliban is in very fancy uniform with very fancy equipment. So, in a sense, America actually has armed the potential threat to America in the process. It's very sad. It's not only very sad, it's very dangerous, particularly for the neighboring nations. And the nervousness that we are seeing at the moment in Tajikistan is very right and very justified because, in 1996, when Mullah Omar was the leader of the Taliban, I mean, the very, very first thing, and don't forget that at that time, the leader of Pakistan was Benazir Bhutto. I don't know. Whenever Pakistan seems to elect anyone from Oxford or Cambridge, the Taliban prospers. But Benazir Bhutto, and she was the prime minister then. And what did the Taliban do? The Taliban sought immediately to use war to expand its space. In Tajikistan, they had to fight a long war. Uzbeks had to fight. Fortunately for them at that time, they had the Lion of Panjshir alive. And, he fought a very, very, very heroic battle and war. But I think today the situation is potentially as dangerous. I know that Russia, for example, is making very careful preparations. In that sense, President Putin is certainly a good strategist for without making too much noise. For to protect countries like Tajikistan. I think the Russians have also offered to sell arms to these countries at quote unquote affordable prices. But the world is, I think, in a quiet way, sort of gearing up for the next phase. I mean, perhaps this year will go in the Taliban trying to consolidate its presence. Its problems this time will be less military and more on the domestic social front. It will have to come to terms. How does it come to terms with one of, I think, the most important legacies of the last 20 years? A very positive development, a development which is heartwarming, a development which we have seen, I have personally seen and applaud, which is the creation of a liberal middle class. And they will have to deal with it. All of them could not have left. Women have been left with aspiration. You can't take them away suddenly from the classrooms and send them back into the world of Jahalat. You can't. But we shall see. We shall see and watch what happens next.
So before we get to Russia and China, Lindsey Graham, Senator Lindsey Graham, who's been at the forefront of these issues, most notably all the areas of trouble, he has made a very telling statement saying that US will have boots on ground very soon, or US will be forced to have boots on ground very soon, because this is not a situation that was expected, and this is not the way the exit was planned. Fundamentally, United States is back at a security risk. Would you agree with that statement, and do you see United States coming back with boots on ground to Afghanistan?
Well, I think the United States acts decisively whenever it is threatened or whenever it is attacked. I am not so sure that anyone in Kabul will be so foolish as to sponsor another 9/11, right? Their strategy might be what I called microaggressions, which will be below the threshold of patience, which means bleed the opponent, bleed the enemy. Don't do anything so dramatic that it invites colossal response. They will try that. But this means that all the forces which can be clubbed together under the broad hand of Taliban and its allies, that they are all working in coordination, or they are all listening to each other or to one another. I am not so sure that ISIS-K is actually listening to. Now, here is a test for America. It's a very simple test. 13 American troops have been killed in front of the world by a suicide mission at Kabul airport, along with 200 or so, the figure maybe a little on this side of or that side, Afghans. It was in front of the world, in front of the cameras, an example of what terrorism is all about. I would like to know, as an Indian, and I think everybody in this audience and the world would like to know, has America demanded from Kabul information about who organized this? Can you get away by saying that this was just a single person who did this on his own? Impossible. It was done by somebody, okay? if you agree that it was done by ISIS-K, let's say, which is the name floating around, will the Taliban hand over the leaders of ISIS-K for justice to America? Will America demand that these people be handed over? After all, 20 years ago, why did America go to war? Because it demanded that the Taliban hand over Osama bin Laden. Mullah Omar refused to do it. And so America went to the United Nations and its operations were agreed upon by the world community. This time, American lives are lost. Has America asked for either local accountability in Afghanistan or, more important, for information about the perpetrators so that they can be identified, brought to justice, and tried as terrorists? Or has Washington lost the will even to hold accountable those who have killed American troops? Strangely, I find no discussion on the subject.
It's very interesting you raised this point, MJG, that there was a press briefing by Mr. Biden post that event, which received much criticism, to state that the perpetrators would be punished at a place and at a time of its choice, and United States is watching. Lo and behold, what happened is an embarrassment. There was a drone strike, apparently believed to be an ISIS-K sympathizer or foot soldier who was supposed to be carrying a truckload of ammunition for another attack. As it turns out, in the last 24 hours, that was not to be. The person who lost the life was just another US NGO acting and helping people on ground, and the casualties were his family and there's no bombs, it's just bottles of water. At least that is the press reports coming out. So you're raising the questions which are being raised even within United States as we speak, but it's very regrettable that you don't see any answers, and there's more inconsistencies that we are seeing, which we have never seen before, between the state, the defense department, and the White House. There's inconsistency even in the reporting of the incidents and the outcomes that flow in terms of their respective interpretations. I've never seen anything remotely close to coming out.
My point was slightly different. Has the American government asked Taliban to help if they have changed? After all, the Americans came to a deal with the Taliban. Doesn't that deal include that the Taliban will help in the war against terrorists or not? Why are they giving the Taliban a free ride? I think that is a question really that should be raised. And of course, that drone attack that we saw, I think it does no credit to, the security systems that you have in America. But that's, another story. The story here that have the Taliban got permission to turn Afghanistan into a sanctuary and a haven and a fortress for terrorist groups, which can act with impunity in the full knowledge that the Minister of Interior now, who has been made Minister of Interior, Sirajuddin Haqqani, is himself a person with a bounty of $10 million on his head. What happens to him? What happens to the FBI notice about him? Has that notice now been withdrawn? Has the Foreign Minister of America, will he now have negotiations with the person wanted by FBI? These are questions. America is a democracy, a great democracy. And I'm sure these are the questions that will be raised in the democratic process of America.
Indeed. I think, at least there are no answers, and we'll wait to see what happens in the in the days ahead. As there's more questions than answers, and as you rightly framed it, there's less and less credible responses coming from the administration, which comprises of the White House, and within the White House, you have the two major departments, which is the State Department and the Department of Defense. So we're not seeing a coherent set of answers coming out, or not even the questions being raised with Afghanistan, as you rightly point out. So this brings us to the next phase, which is China. Taliban says that it is now working with China, partnering with China, and reciprocal. China is saying that it is supporting Taliban in its endeavor, and it is not. Most foreign diplomatic missions have been moved out of Afghanistan, either into Qatar or they have gone back into the respective countries. Only you find, if I'm correct, China, Turkey, and not even Turkey, China and Russia having some footprint in Afghanistan. So what do we see as the role of China, and how does that influence what is going to transpire in Afghanistan and in the region?
I think China is a careful nation. We should not jump to conclusions about what its long-term policy towards Taliban will be. It will, I think, certainly wait and see what happens. At the moment, it is possible, I can't be certain, but it is possible that Beijing may be under the influence of the views expressed by its ally and a kind of foster state for Islamabad. And they may have taken the Islamabad view that it is reasonable to give Taliban an opportunity, and they may be playing along. But it is not in China's long-term interests to support or sustain a theocratic ideological terrorist movement. It is not in China's interest. China will have to join countries like ours, India, in the common fight against terrorism, and do it not because we say so, but do it in its own self-interest. And that's a process that needs watching, and we will know more about it with time.
Right. Coming to the West Asian nations and the Central Asian republics, which are very proximate and have direct consequence to the events unfolding in Afghanistan, how do you see that shaping up in the context of these developments? Sir?
Well, the most important, I think, development has taken place in Iran. Iran, of course, has on principle always said that America's presence of American forces outside America is adventurism and it will fail. So on that point, it has been consistent, whether it's on Afghanistan or on Iraq or wherever it might be. What Iran has also made it very clear that it will not be ready to support an Afghanistan that does not give equality and does not have a plural system. Which means what? Which means that the Shias of Afghanistan cannot be turned into second-class citizens. The Shia Shura of Afghanistan has already protested and said that it should be governed by the Jafri jurisprudence, which is its own version of the Sharia. And as Shias, they have a right to it. I think Shia leaders, like former President Ahmadinejad, he told WION, the television news channel, was very critical about the role played by Pakistan. I think the former foreign minister of Iran, Mohammad Javad, he also was very, very critical about how things have been shaping up in Afghanistan. So Iran will not be that easy to deal with for the Taliban, and Iran is by far the most powerful country, to its west. Uh, the Towards its north, the whole of Central Asia is, as I said earlier, in feels a sense of perhaps oncoming turbulence, which it wants to preempt. It is certainly trying its best to strengthen its security and its defenses, and it is gearing up for what might be called the long war. And I think the the decision, whoever made it, to bring back the Taliban will create geopolitical tremors. First, which will be most intensely felt in its own region, towards its north in particular. Uh, it will spread all across. But let me suggest that the country in the long term, which will be most affected, Islamabad has always believed that it has overriding influence, or should have overriding influence, over Kabul. And certainly in the first Taliban regime, which is 1996 to 2001, Islamabad had far greater influence over Kabul than Kabul had over Islamabad. This time, this time, Pakistan should be also worried, even if they will never accept it or never express it. And that is, there is much more serious danger of the Talibanization of Pakistan, because the madrasa factories, which have been churning out these ideologues, they haven't stopped. The situation within Pakistan in many of its provinces has become fertile for such ideologies to prosper and such groups to prosper. And I think there is an old proverb saying, "Be careful what you wish for." Pakistan should be very careful of what it has wished for.
So I think it is going back to the pre 9/11 or post 9/11 immediate. There was, as you rightly framed again, uh, Taliban was asked, would you hand over the remnant forces of Al Qaeda, which is in your country, and most notably Mr. Osama bin Laden? They did not, and the war started. Then we have now most of the Al Qaeda seems to be intact, barring the leaders, including Mr. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who is still undergoing his trial in United States as we speak, back in full helm in the Taliban territory. And there was no ISIS at that point of time. ISIS emerged post 9/11 and most notably around the 2004 2005. So now you have ISIS, you have Al Qaeda, then you have Taliban, then you have these forces of JEM and others, all now within the parameter or within the country of Afghanistan as it stands today. So how is the world going to deal with this situation, and who is going to be the person? It's clearly not United States as we speak. So is there an alternate set of voices that are likely to emerge to have the discussion with this group? Is it India that could be playing a part in this along with Russia or Britain together?
Reactions, Sridhar, will be determined by events. When you talk of Al Qaeda, it is my understanding, of course, I cannot be certain about it, but I am reasonably sure that the whole Al Qaeda leadership is still in Pakistan, and it has been getting protection. Ayman al Zawahiri, Hamza Rabia, Abu Faraj, Abu Zubaydah, these leaders, which are there, probably hiding in plain sight, just as Osama bin Laden was once hiding in plain sight. And it's a question now of what they will probably want to do next. Would they want to go to Afghanistan, where they feel safer, where they feel less vulnerable than in Pakistan? We don't know. But certainly, a new space has been created for their operations and for their safety. As far as what the world will do, I think the world will probably wait for events of what happens next. And we have heard Ryan Crocker, the ambassador, I think President Barack Obama's ambassador to Kabul, saying that the what happened in August has energized these forces tremendously. He was very critical of the of what the president of America did, but the point is less that than the consequences. The consequences that these forces have been energized, and they, having seen this as a great victory of the greatest superpower in history, will now feel that the time has come to follow up on that and to deal with lesser powers, quote unquote, that they can confront and that they can defeat. So I think if they go into this stage of operations, the world will be forced to react.
Great. So, which brings us to India. India is one of the countries which is significantly impacted, along with the Central Asian republics, due to the vulnerabilities and the uncertainty caused by the regrouping of many of these people that we have been talking about. So, how does India handle the situation, and what is its way forward?
Well, India handled the situation on two fronts. One is the diplomatic front, where our Prime Minister is very clear on this. And as you saw during the BRICS summit, he put terrorism back at the top of the agenda, was very categorical, very clear, as he always is on the subject. And India will force or try to force the world to recognize the dimensions of this danger once again after a lull or a period of complacency. The second, India is going to be very, very careful about its own security. And I think our whole security apparatus and its leadership is very conscious of this. And we are certainly not going to permit any foreign intervention to destabilize our country in any way. No way. People should not underestimate India.
Great. Thank you so much. Sriji, I think we've spent about 50 minutes, into the session. In case you have any questions, to MJG, you can, post those questions, and then we can open it to the public.
Yes, and thank you so much, MJ Akbar ji. Thank you so much, Sridhar ji. If we look at the number of questions and the breadth of questions that you've asked, Sridhar ji, you've covered just about any and every question that people have in their minds. And thank you, Akbar ji, for sharing your opinion, having been in the front lines to dealing with these people on a one-on-one basis. You have really, really opened our eyes to what are the realities, ground realities. I have only one question, Akbarji. I am looking at it purely from America's point of view. America went in 2001 October. They wanted to get Osama bin Laden. They had him cornered at Tora Bora, and then something went horribly wrong. They trusted some people to bring him out of the caves. That did not happen. Instead, he slipped into Pakistan. And at that point, US could have made a decision. Okay, now this guy has moved there. Taliban is gone. It's at least put up, like for example, Karzai was installed as the prime minister. Elections took place. They even wrote the constitution. The US should have exited at that point. Instead, they stayed on for 20 years. From what I'm hearing now, every month, the US had to basically bankroll the government of Afghanistan. So it could pay salaries, it could pay, people and so on and so forth. So this was the recurring expenditure that was happening for US. And with what in return? That's probably why Trump, the businessman, who was a businessman first and then president, perhaps decided that this is not worth doing it. And also, the irony is, if you let Afghanistan to fend for itself and don't give any cash infusion, the only economy that they had was their drug crop. So you have a situation where neither whatever you do, it's not going to help. So today, all the US could do was to freeze the $8 billion odd assets of Afghanistan that is in the United States. Beyond that, the US cannot do much. But at the same time, now they have armed some people to the teeth. Interestingly, a general of the ex-general of the Indian Army, he came on our show and he said that more than the Black Hawks, more than the fighter aircraft, the one thing that concerns India is the number of assault rifles, 100,000, I believe, that the US have left behind. So my question to you, Akbarji, is it's now going to be like a free-for-all where you said that there are so many madrasas now that are probably teaching ideology of a much more radical form of Islam in Pakistan. What's to prevent these rifles from getting distributed? We already know the kind of ethnic genocide that's going on in Pakistan. I mean, I'm just worried that is India going to see another influx of refugees from Pakistan? Your thoughts, sir?
No, I don't think we are going to see any influx of refugees from Pakistan. Our borders are fenced, and our security system is fairly secured there, and fairly good. So, if you're talking about an influx of terrorists, which can always happen through the porous Himalayas, the mountains, yes, that is a serious danger. We are alive to that danger, uh, and all the precautions that are possible are being taken. The I'm not totally sure about the figures that are often trotted out in terms of America's expenditure in Afghanistan. Let me just tell you that out of the numbers that are trotted out, America spent $1 trillion alone on intelligence gathering, right? So much of the expenditure that went on was there, which was actually directed towards the expenditure for its own presence there, rather than going into the Afghan economy or into the Afghan. And yes, the Afghan economy has depended on drugs. I remember George Bush saying very clearly that they were going to eradicate the opiums. Right? Have you ever wondered, Sridhar, who pays for Afghanistan's poppy and Afghanistan's drugs? Who pays for them? It's a Western street. They buy it. They buy their purchases at a very high price have created the supply market. Do you think these drugs actually reach American cities on Aladdin's flying carpet? They reach through ships and heaven knows land and whatever systems by which drugs go. How many countries are involved along the way? There is a whole network of business operators which have been there before 9/11, during 9/11, right now. Couldn't America have done something about poppy growing? It didn't. Many NATO troops, in fact, had the other problem, a drug problem. So, it's sometimes a close analysis of facts uh, doesn't make some of the conversation that is thrown around sound very logical.
Completely agree. Completely agree. I think the largest market for the OPM, at least based on anecdotal and the evidence that you see in the media, United States. And as you rightly said, many countries are involved. And this is a question which we have discussed even in some of the other panels. Why United States chose not to burn all those opium fields, which is the principal source of revenue for Taliban? It remains a big mystery.
Why don't you ask the American police system, the NYPD, and the various people why they cannot control the criminals who sell drugs? Forget trying to, reform Helmand province. Why didn't you reform certain areas of New York?
Very true.
Well, that was a fascinating discussion, and I think we have covered a fair amount of ground looking at all the different things that are buffeting this poor nation called Afghanistan. And it hurts a little bit to know that this used to be part of India not long ago. And yet, while India may have stuttered, India has progressed quite a bit. Anything that chose to stay away has actually hurt pretty badly. Although I must say that Afghanistan perhaps could have been part of India if there was some creativity on part of the Indian leadership at that point. I think it's all water under the bridge. MJ Akbarji, thank you very much for coming on.
No, I don't think Afghanistan was ever part of India. I think that is an error. It wasn't.
Okay.
Burma and Afghanistan were never parts of India.
They were under the British rule, but they did get independent separately.
They were not. They were part of the British Empire.
Right.
Kenya was also part of the British Empire. Sri Lanka was part of the British Empire. Sri Lanka is not part of India.
Anyway, the sad part is that when your neighbor's house is burning, you do have to do something about it. So we have to see what India does. And thank you very much, sir. And I'm hoping that we'll be having you back again, maybe 4 to 6 weeks down the road, when we can read the situation a little bit better. Clearly, what is happening today is that the Pakistani forces, with maybe some Taliban forces, have completely sealed off the entry into the Panjshir Valley. They are trying to essentially take them, completely deprive them of food, medicines, what have you. And now they have, armory to even shoot down planes that might come bringing in supplies. That's what I'm hearing. I hope that somewhere sanity prevails. You cannot just want to catch Amrullah Saleh and the junior Masood. You can't kill the entire population there. So we don't know how it's going to play out. But be that as it may, I think we are headed for interesting times. Thank you very much, Akbarji, and we'll be back again very soon with news on Afghanistan. Namaskar.
Thank you very, very much, Sri and Sridhar. Very kind of you for hosting this, and I hope this was of elucidation and some relevance. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
Thank you.